Greek life. It's not all these other things that we talked about. So it's fundamentally changed education. It's fundamentally changed commerce. 36 million unemployed mean, let's ask that question, we are all in this together. Wait a minute, it turns out that of those people who have lost jobs in the last 3 months, 40% earned less than $40,000. Of those who made more than $40,000, 6% have lost their job. So right now we can talk about the difference in the ethnic group and the economics and the general health status. We can talk about social groups. We can say that the red states haven't had quite the same pandemic that the blue states have had. We can ask all of those questions about stratification of the we. We are all in this together, but no, not our we, your we. And so that's again my question that comes from the Oslerism. Ask what kind of patient has this disease? Because all patients are not created equal, despite our Constitution that says so in the polity. The polity has not caught up with the health effect. So yes, some of us have better health than others. Thanks to the grace of God, it may be true. Thanks to some information base, it may be otherwise true. Remember, health and wealth are correlated, but not linearly. It might be a U-shaped curve. And some of those that we are seeing are effects of the coronavirus falling into that rising morbidity of the wealthy. Now that's a real kick, because you can understand when starving patients are dying.
Yes.
But why me when I've had 3 square meals a day and a few fine liquors on the course of it, and drive a fast car, and so health and wealth have this U shape in many of the parts of the world where I am looking about. This came to me in a picture this week. A friend of mine has been diligently working on a hospital in Mozambique, in a town of 1.3 million people, inhabitants, called Nampula, Mozambique, up in the north in the Asa province, which I've worked in. He's been a missionary and he's worked very diligently. He is a surgeon, but doesn't practice surgery because he's been working so hard at fundraising and evangelizing and getting this group together. And he's got this thing called Grace Mission, built a hospital, and he was really eager to open that, effective its completion 24 months ago. Permits didn't come through. I mean, it's not ready, it's not. And he was building a clinic on the basis of some funds that he had gathered from lots of his Texas Baptist colleagues. And it was about $200,000, and he built a clinic. No. The government says, we're not going to certify a clinic. We want a first world tertiary hospital, nothing less. So for 20 years, he's been going back to the same well, getting more and more, and now there's $17 million into this establishment.
Wow.
And for 24 months, it hasn't been certified. Why? Because the government didn't build it, they did. The government has certified it, the government can't certify it. The Mozambican government just came by this past week and says, we're ready to certify it. And the 2 governors are standing there. You can't miss them, because here's this fellow who's a surgeon who looks a lot like me. And there's the 2 governors, which equal about 4 of me and maybe 5 of him. Why? Because we are impressing your hospital into service for the coming surge of the COVID-19 patients. So it was not good enough for the purposes of volunteer mission operations for the care for the people and the problems they had. It's there so that the government can say, look, we've made available to you, we've brought online this $17 million hospital, as though they had something to do with it. So everybody in the political arena is looking for credit. Look what I've done for you. When not they had anything to do with it, whether they actively interfered with it. Now, it's fun to say that looking at Mozambique, because that's over there. Now look over here. Now, as I say, the highest offices in the land can't quite distinguish antimicrobial, whether it's antibiotic or antiseptic, and they might want you to inhale Clorox or
have you ever read a book called Political Crime?
No.
Oh, you've got to read it. It was written in the 1800s, and it has examples exactly parallel to what you're describing.
I will look for it. I'll give you a title that you must look for. And I'll give you this because it's a near neighbor of mine when I was growing up. He lived in Holland, Michigan. And before I was in high school, I got this book. Someone gave it to me on the basis of the fact that I'm sure you'll like this or you'll understand it. His name was Paul de Kruif. Good Dutch name for Holland, Michigan. And he wrote a book, which is not just in my opinion, but a lot of others, called he followed a fellow named Hans Zinzer.
Mm-hmm.
And the title of the book is Rats, Lice, and History.
My goodness, interesting.
It's a bit like a Los Angeles anthropologist, which is Guns, Germs, and Steel. And he also traces down human civilization and development and how it's been used in directions that you would, maybe I as well, would consider progress, with a whole biome that might be going off in another direction, and how they interlace once in a while, such as the lousy World War I trenches and all of the. So as I said to you when we last had a conversation, that in human warfare, it wasn't until Vietnam that we got to casualties from battlefield injuries as the leading cause of death. And from the Korean back through World War I, all the way to Spanish America, all the way, so 2/3, 4/5 of the casualties, the deaths occurred from incidental diseases caused by this fellow I mentioned to you at one time, the founder of anatomic pathology. His name was Rudolf Virchow. Now, how much more of an insular biomedical scientist can you get than a guy who's looking through a microscope, identifying stuff in the stain? Rudolf Virchow. He had a social conscience and ran for and was elected to the mayor of Vienna. And he made the statement that in any mass disease, which we would today call epidemic, they are all a direct result of a disturbance in human culture. So identify for me any disease that has taken over a whole society, in other words, an epidemic, or has taken over the globe, the pandemics. Each occurred as a result of a disturbance of human culture. Now remember, we had one great example of that. We had a fellow who lived in the White House, right there on Pennsylvania Avenue, only 5 blocks from me, who never uttered a word about a problem. And he had a bigger obligation. He had a much more serious preoccupation. He was in the middle of a war to end war. Woodrow Wilson never bothered to say one public word about the 1918 influenza pandemic. In fact, it was an epidemic. It was an epidemic in the U.S., started largely in the Kansas barracks, and back and forth to New England and around as the trainees were going. And then, with the doughboys and the trenches, became a worldwide phenomenon. Everyone clamped down on it. The only people that weren't active combatants were in Spain, so it was called the Spanish flu. They had no right to get that name. In fact, it's the Kansas flu. But the fact is, 656,000 Americans, that's 2/3 of a million. That's more than...
what was our population at that time?
I am not sure, but it was less than half of what it is now.
Oh, way less than that.
Yeah, I'm just saying it's probably 120 or something like that. Now, what means that is that, as I said already, that the coronavirus death rate today, tonight it'll hit 87,000. That's half again as much as as Vietnam War, our longest war until the Vietnam era, until the Afghanistan war era. 2/3 of a million was our American death toll, and if you take it globally, that's 75 to 100 million deaths from influenza in 1918, which is more than the deaths of all the world wars. So his war to end wars was lost by not even looking at the mall where there were demonstrators. And what were they doing? They had these Red Cross things, and it's kind of quaint. I'll show you the pictures of it. They were picking people up on stretchers and carrying them into a little ambulance, which was one step up from the horse-drawn one. It had the carriage, but the carriage was backed onto a little platform from a motorized vehicle. The same scoop and run we do with trauma, rushing them to a hospital where what happened? It was a scoop and run to no therapy. There was no treatment for influenza. What are we doing today? We have our first responders racing around, picking up these patients and bringing them to our intensive. For what? Therapy. There is no treatment for coronavirus. Full stop. If it's as crazy as Clorox and ultraviolet, or if it's as stupid as saying hydroxychloroquine, of which I have a considerable amount of experience, and believe you me, you don't want to have that drug if it doesn't give you a benefit, and it turns out to be proven now to give a direct disbenefit. To remdesivir, which I told you doesn't change the death rate. And in fact, with a very substantial study published in China, we don't have to read it. It's published in China, right? Showed that the remdesivir control arm did better than the remdesivir arm. So remember again that the only benefit they were able to decree, because we were desperate, show me something good. So now remdesivir is called a treatment. And there is no control arm. Everybody's going to get it now. Mm-hmm. The reason is it showed statistically significantly in 60% of the survivors a 4-day shortening of their hospitalization. And for that, you shut down the biggest economy in the world? You could pay for that extra 4 days with 1% of what we just lost. And you know that that isn't likely to be listened to because everyone is so desperate to say, we're working strong, now we're going to get a vaccine. I know a little bit about vaccine, more than most surgeons do, but only for a couple of strange reasons. One of it being, I've got a public health background, also epidemiology degree. But more than that, my hometown congressman kept in touch with me, and for that reason, in the 70s, I was pulled into a panel, and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation funded me at the time, clinical scholar of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And this was the Gerald Ford administration, and they said something that was what could be simplistic, but it's less simplistic than today. And it said, swine flu is coming back, and we better be ready. We've got to crank it up, and we've got to produce a vaccine. We should have a vaccine before the swine flu epidemic hits. We've got isolated cases here. We've got a number of them, and it's on a curve. The curve looks pretty sharp. Remind me in a moment when we said flattening the curve, I'll tell you what a sharp curve looks like, and you don't want it. Here comes a sharp curve. So big campaign, lots of vaccines, except the U.S., these are big companies, pharma has lawyers, and they have a lot of good scientists, and they are very ahead of the game. Mm-hmm. Said to the U.S. Congress, not on us. We want to be indemnified for any liability for this vaccine. As a consequence, we will produce it. We will do exactly what you commanded. They use the same principle that is currently done for the War Powers Act, where you order General Motors to produce 150,000. Right. They said, order up a vaccine and do it now for swine flu. So the campaign was called, Roll Up Your Sleeves, America. Gerald R. Ford, and he said, here's the simplistic statement. And remember, simple as it might be, it resonates today. Better to have a vaccine program and no epidemic than have the epidemic with no vaccine program.
God, that's a pretty sound statement.
Okay, now hold that thought. Tell me how sound it is now. So 25% of America is vaccinated. Big deal. I mean, we're not talking small deal. Remember, at that time, the population in the U.S. is about 275 million?
Yeah.
What happened? Swine flu was sharp, steep curve. A lot of people, and it quenched. So the incidence of the disease was dropping as the vaccine program was set up, not because of it. And it quenched itself, the same way SARS-1 did. MERS is still active around it, but SARS-1 went up, down. It was lethal. So a lethal disease doesn't hang around. And so as a consequence...
So did the Spanish flu.
It is a congenital. It's an influenza, not the coronavirus, which is 400 times bigger than the influenza virus.
Yeah.
It is an influenza. And my job is, as health promotion, disease prevention epidemiologist, to look at this and to say, should we continue to the next 75% of America? Well, for two reasons. Mainly the first. No one listened to it after I heard the second. The first was swine flu endemia is not turning into an epidemic because it is self-quenching and it is dropping rapidly, so the risk decreases before the vaccine program is finally spread. Here's number two, and you better believe everyone understands this one and it resonated well. Associated with, perhaps not caused by, but associated with, there were 30 deaths of those vaccinated. And then there were 450 Guillain-Barré syndrome. That looks a lot like polio, and it's paralysis of the phrenic nerve, and they had to take out those iron lungs we talked about before. So, in fact, 30 deaths, 450 mortal morbidities, meant program was cut off right there at the moment. So swine flu ended with a roll down your sleeves, America campaign, standing down the whole of the program. Now,
My goodness, I didn't know that.
swine flu, and I was there, 70s, and so now, here, let me tell you about another one. And this is even more interesting to me. This is fascinating because, do you know the bacillus developed in the Louis Pasteur Institute, where they said tuberculosis is a very big problem all around the world. And as a consequence, we need to develop an attenuated mycobacterium. Mycobacterium tuberculosis causes pulmonary TB. So we're going to make a new bacillus by modifying it and injuring it, giving it a little dose of formalin that's going to keep it from, it's going to become not infectious. But it still has all the mycobacterium, so we're going to scarify you here, and we're going to make a thing there, and that's going to be called BCG, Bacillus calmette-guerin, the two people who developed the bacillus. So now we have a mycobacterium that's attenuated, and it confers a delayed hypersensitivity, second order, the same as rejection from another. So now in the world, if you give BCG to a population, the tuberculosis rate goes down. That's good. That's very, very good. The problem with it is that when you develop immunity to the BCG, which cross-reacts with some of the mycobacterium tuberculosis, you also lose the marker for exposure to TB because now you've been sensitized by BCG. So you, in Canada and in other places in the world, have had what's called a time test, and it's a tuberculin. You take what was called PPD, purified protein derivative of the tuberculin, inject it in the skin, it turns red and indurated. That means you have an immunity, a cell-mediated immunity to the mycobacterium. Get BCG, you have a positive test, which means I can't tell whether you're exposed to TB or whether you're exposed to BCG. So you lose one of the markers. Remember, that was the time when you did exactly what you're supposed to do today, which is in surveillance, case identification, and follow-up contacts. A wonderful experiment that could never be no one in ethics would ever allow this. But it happened because we ran out of money. Chicago Public Schools. Everybody at the time of my parents, and yours certainly, and possibly even you, at least in some parts of the world, many of the people that come from Europe that go with me have been BCG inoculated. I wasn't, because I'm just beyond this Chicago school story. They went out to inoculate all school children in Chicago. They did it methodically, one ward precinct by a time. The wards that were so well used by His Honor, the mayor. And they went through them methodically in a very big program, and they vaccinated, and they got half through. Boom! No more money. and they could no longer go out and vaccinate with BCG the population of school children. Now here's the uninteresting conclusion, because a little bit later when the economy got back and they got better stuff, because remember this was the Depression era. So now what happened is that they went out there and they now have money enough, and so they mounted a surveillance of all these kids that had come through the program. All those that were vaccinated, and more importantly, the half that weren't. And now here's the uninteresting conclusion. The tuberculosis rate in a group that had BCG was 1/10. So it's protective. Now, that's the end of the study, so let's not talk about it anymore. No, not so fast. Wait a minute, here's the next question. What is the leukemia and lymphoma rate of those vaccinated and those not? And it turns out that the group not getting BCG had 6 times the leukemia lymphoma rate. What it means is that is called immune training. The phenomenon is called immune training, which means if you alert the body to an antigen, in this case a cell-mediated response in the BCG, you're going to have them picking off invaders of any other kind, including what is called tumor-specific transplant antigens, TSTAs, which means that a cell becomes malignant and develops new protein antigens that are recognized as foreign and you're suppressed. The theory being that yesterday you developed 2 or 3 cancers, and that over the course of this time you've had macrophages that said, hey, this is non-self, and has eliminated it. It's only when you are immunosuppressed that these take over and become big enough to take on the host. So immune training is one of the things that can be tried for coronavirus. So going around inoculating people with what we've got, which is well known and because it's been around for 80 years, BCG would help, because BCG inoculation would give immune training against that illness. Bingo. Okay, now what's the story of BCG? Why shouldn't everybody get it? Well, in the first place, BCG is protective against tuberculosis. If you have a high rate of tuberculosis, just like it was for the Gerald Ford administration, with a high rate of swine flu, you ought to have a vaccine program. When the TB rate goes so low, the marginal disbenefit and cost does not warrant it. So I grew up in a TB relatively free America. Now I go abroad where I'm susceptible once again. However, those people out there have had the BCG because they still haven't had their TB rates go down. Now what's the next question? Well, let's look at the other things that happen besides not getting leukemia lymphoma. Is there anything else about that group that got BCG inoculum who are immune trained? Yeah. They get autoimmune disease. They get a higher rate of arthritis and nephritis, irritable bowel syndrome. They get a number of those things that we don't have any control of. Some of them have thyroid problems, some of them. So in essence, when you're stirring up the immune system, you don't give it marching orders to do all good and no bad. So now why is it hydroxychloroquine was pulled off the shelf and said, this is the game changer, this is the new thing? Well, it's because a number of those people for whom it's being given had autoimmune disease. Lupus being the biggest example of that, rheumatoid arthritis being another. Well, if it's good enough for them, it's good enough for everyone. Wait just a minute, let's talk about its disbenefits. Well, it's a cardiac agent right now to slow down heart rate and conductivity. I know that. I know it the hard way because I got IV quinine and they were bouncing on my chest when I was unaware of it because it stops the heart. So as a consequence, the yin and the yang here are always to be considered. Now, when I said there are 30 deaths from a quarter of the US population being vaccinated against swine flu, 450 iron lung ventilations because of Guillain-Barré. What happens when you inject our brand new vaccine for coronavirus into 7.8 billion people on planet Earth? If that were sterile water, you'd come back with thousands of deaths and tens of thousands of mortal disease. And that's because association is not distinguished from cause. They at least have come to medical attention having been vaccinated. So who's going to bear that liability? I can assure you that there's no U.S. drug company that's at the front of this charge saying, I'll take it all on, the good and the bad and the ugly. And even Gilead, who makes the remdesivir, is saying, we're going to give you the first 1.5 million after that. Not until you take on the liability will we produce another vial of this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because they have lawyers and they recognize the curve. Now remember, we've been talking statistics. What do statistics do? It makes sure that when you take a sample of the population, it is a representative sample.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why we have statistics to keep us valid. You don't need a single statistic if you're taking the whole population. So with 7.8 billion doses of vaccine out there, I don't need a statistic because I'm using the entire globe's population as my sample. I have no control sample. And as a consequence, I'm going to get almost a pure distillate of vaccine problems. There's already a group of wackos out there who don't like vaccines. Now that's true for those things for which we have well-established treatments. I mean, I've already mentioned the two groups that are for politically legitimate reasons not taking up polio.
Yeah.
Is there any doubt that polio vaccine works? I was in Horace Rackham Hall, the University of Michigan, when the most honorable fellow who taught me epidemiology, his name was Thomas, unveiled the blind results of the polio vaccine trial and showed that it worked. And that's when Sabin stood up, Salk stood up and said, I want to acknowledge that this vaccine works, and never mentioned any of his colleagues, which cost him the Nobel Prize right there. I wouldn't have voted for him either. But the fact is, polio vaccine works. These two groups don't want any surveillance of any kind, polio or otherwise. Mm-hmm. As a consequence, they are also producing the last polio endemia on Earth. So now you tell me, once again, the difference between liberty and public health, because they have the liberty to do so, at least they can enforce it. And so can some of the wackos who say, with absolutely no evidence, that vaccination causes autism and we want to prevent that, and so they're doing it. So that means that are we going to allow their freedom of expression of their absolutely idiotic beliefs to endanger other citizens? Because we have now said they aren't part of the herd. But they can opt out of the herd. You're going to allow anyone in this new vaccine program to opt out. Or are you going to do what happened to me as a child? As a child, I can remember this so well because I saw people in white coats with clipboards and ballpoint pens. And twice a year, I was in Grand Rapids, Michigan, in Kent County, in 4th grade. I would come in and they would have me sit in a chair and they would look over and they would start doing numbers. 1A, 2B, 3B.
Of course, with a society that doesn't worry about ethics anymore, what does it matter?
Well, I'm going to point out that that was an ethics violation according to even your rules, because Grand Rapids, Michigan was the sample for fluoridation of water.
Oh my goodness.
And I'm one of the fluoride kids, and they counted dental caries. And they proved that fluoridation of water decreases dental caries. Therefore, the water supply in the U.S. will be fluoridated by law. Ka-chunk. Now, did you agree to that?
No.
You never knew about it.
No.
And as a consequence, your liberties have been deprived by that much.
That's why Scotland has so many bad teeth in their population, because they got no fluoride in the water.
That's because they eat haggis, you know
that.
Oh, no. They dissolve their enamel with scotch. I know that very well. As a fact, you can take that to the bank. So you're once again running afoul of Locke's principle, which is whenever there's a complex decision to be made, always err in the side of maximum liberty. So sin on the side of freedom. Don't go the other way. So I'm going to tell you it's good for you to wear a shadow, because you should know that skin exposed to sunshine is not going to hold up as well as it would. I know that, and you know it a whole lot better than I do.
I do, yeah, right.
Why can't I coerce you as a child so that you didn't wind up as you are now as an adult? Why did I get fluoridated water? No, my parents didn't vote. My grandparents wouldn't have known. And I only remember this because that was a fascinating story for me to be sitting in a chair. I'd never gone to a dentist before in my life.
Mine's an easy answer. I love playing golf.
And that is a reason that is absolutely, in your instance, compelling. And I will not, under any circumstances, say you should not play golf, bloody UV or otherwise. And in fact, if you want to play golf at night, that might be one of the regulations that we'll have to put on you. No, I'd say that to the degree that I can eliminate traffic fatalities by outlawing the internal combustion engine.
Now's a good time to end our little session by anyone saying for a minute that I can't play golf.
Now, as soon as someone says podcasting causes insanity, I'm unwilling to give up certain things myself. Now, if you tell me that there's an associated risk, I agree. Now, we know that cigarette smoking causes problems. I mean, that's a given. Should you deny yourself that pleasure, if pleasure it happens to be, on the basis of your own mortality? Well, if I'm paying for it, maybe yes. But if you're exhaling in my face, yes. Okay, so now I have a freedom to not be wearing a face mask. And I'm not living with you except at dinner time, so every third week or so. I'm not one of your household intimates. I have chosen not to wear a mask. Well, that's my risk to me, right? How about you? Why should I be wearing a mask for your sake? I was just denied my freedom to go to Camp Black Bear. I'm the founder of Camp Black Bear and its chief financial support. And 4 or 5 members of a family group, 3 or 4 of those not members, all went on opening day of turkey season and had a wonderful time. They sent back a video of them singing loudly. Remember I gave you the article about singing? Right. And they went out and they got a turkey. And I'm sitting at home all packed up, ready to go. But I was denied access to Camp Black Bear because I am a healthcare provider. I would be the Jonah on that ship.
When was this?
This was last weekend, 2 weekends now, a weekend from the coming one. So I was denied. I know that. I'm just going to summarize there by saying, for your health benefits and mine, we're bringing this to a close. But the answer is some of my freedoms were denied for the public good, but not by me. I can understand volunteering for that. Last weekend, I did not go up to Camp Black Bear to watch the springtime and hear
Oh, tough. Isn't that tough?
And that was about as hard on me as you're not playing golf on this wonderful...
now I'm sympathetic, all right.
And at the same time, we have to ask John Locke, if I can coerce you to give up golf, and they can coerce me to give up a visit in the springtime to go turkey
The answer is no.
bird watching. So given that, now can I deny you the vaccine because you're above age? Can I deny you the ability to enter the George Washington Hospital because you're at higher risk? Number 1. Number 2, you might be a carrier. Number 3, should you and I both come down with the disease, do we acknowledge their right to deny?
Well, when you go, I got a question.
Yeah.
So they're talking vaccines could be 12 to 18 months away.
at least.
Some-
And then we have to ask the question,
Some
vaccine
people are
induces
saying
antibody, does it protect? We don't
they
know
want to
that.
lock down until there's a vaccine.
Right.
And people are hearing that and ready to rebel. I mean,
Let me give you
protesting
another
and
piece of
rebelling.
that even more complicated issue. They have just proven, beyond a shadow of a doubt, in Russia, that a woman who developed COVID-19 and has the test to show the virus, and then developed the antibodies, which shows that she was clearing the virus and was over it, has returned with a second case of COVID-19. So if you can't get any better vaccination than having the disease in the first place,
Right.
what were those other than a marker? They weren't protective. And the fact is, you know that from your own experience, because the second to the last cold you got didn't do very well in protecting you from the last one.
Right.
So that every time that I get a new subtle little shift, you can understand that if it's a new virus, or the virus went through a dramatic drift, so that it is totally different, the way the swine flu, the 1918 flu came around. In a shift or a drift, you can understand it. How about getting the same virus back and finding my antibodies didn't do a thing to protect me?
Well-
So the new COVID-19 cases are on top of the antibodies to COVID-19.
So, just listening, it doesn't sound like you're a big fan of the lockdown because it may not really,
Well, the
in the long run.
No, the lockdown is a very good idea for the early part of limiting the number of carriers. Now what you have to do is the surveillance by testing and then contact surveillance. So it's exactly what eradicated smallpox.
How long will it really take to get enough tests to isolate people against it?
Well, in the whole province of Wuhan, which has now been surveilled twice, that's how they find that there are new cases coming on top of those that they
Right.
already had. That is, limited about how many tests you want to put out there and how many people are doing the test. In George Washington University 5 weeks ago, our chief of pathology, who was born in Spain, and her name is Sepulveda, and she's a German, and she's skilled at laboratory techniques. She's not the anatomic pathologist that I described with Virchow looking at tissues. She does laboratory tests, and with both CPR and CRISPR, she has stood up a virus and an antibody identification thing within 1 week.
Wow.
And within that 1 week, they went from 0 to 1,500 in their first week, and now they're doing 4,500
Per week.
per week. Now that means all of the staff and all of the patients in GW. Now the next question is, how many people are you going to screen that were contacts with? So for example, assume that you're one of the staff. Are you now going to test your wife and your daughter and casual people that might have come and gone in contact with you, or people that are working side by side with you? The article that I gave you by Bromish, who is a biology teacher, is very well thought out, and he points out that the single highest risk areas are those of close, confined contact in air that doesn't circulate in a contained environment. Number one, call centers. Number two, meatpacking plants. One of those happens to be in Maryland, and that's where the chicken processing, right here, goes on in Salisbury, Maryland. And that is, you can't get away from them, and the air circulation is such that even if it circulated toward you. The one call center they had a ventilator that was coming across the way, and the people on the far side weren't, and the people on the near side were. There was a restaurant that stayed open. The outer 6 tables never got it. Everyone on this side did. And so, yes, and then they say if you go outdoors, now you've got a denominator to dilute that down to sub-infective levels. And if I were a known common carrier, a big spreader, and running through the park, I mean, our transit time, even within 6, even though I'm deep breathing, would be of a subinoculant.
Right.
Now, if you're going to hang around somebody who is a spreader and that someone has fomites, I was amazed to see in a public article in the New York Times the word fomites without an explanation what it means. It means any particular surface or common shared item. A washcloth, a t-shirt, a napkin or a table surface here. Those are all fomites that can spread from one individual to another. So what it means is that if you are in a closed air space and or have a surface that's been contaminated within that closed airspace that's shared, but once you're out in the sunshine, once you're out in a very large air circulation, your inoculum piddles away so quickly. And you've had coronaviruses hit you 5 times during the course of the week.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't develop either a cold or coronavirus, COVID. And as a consequence, it means that at a minimum, you're able to take care of this. Now, that doesn't mean you're protected necessarily. As I said already, the early antibody, you get a globulin response. And the globulin that forms, they're Y chains, they're light chains and heavy chains. And their heavy chain ends, they look like Ys. And their bottoms, the Y ends, stick together. So there's this massive thing, and it's called IgM, immunoglobulin M, macroglobulin. That's the first thing that happens. A virus particle is identified by a macrophage, and it produces IgM. And as it matures, especially in the mucosal surface, you get a protein, a little piece of protein. It's called a secretory piece, and it sticks 2 of these Ys together. And that's called IgA, not the grocery store.
Right.
That's immunoglobulin A. And the secretory piece means it comes from a mucosal surface, the gut or the nasopharynx or otherwise. Now when you check it in the blood, you've got a highly specific one-way antibody. It's good for nothing except that virus. So I can tell you with an IgG, which is called gamma globulin, that IgG is anti-COVID-19. Now, if you now have somebody who's had the disease and is recovered from it, you can take their plasma and you can just say, I don't know what's in here. I'll just separate the big proteins, the clot, and I'll take out your serum. And what that serum has is a soluble protein antigens, antibodies. So what happens now, I'm going to give you convalescent serum. That's how, in my case, they identified Lassa fever. I was the first one exposed to Lassa fever in Lassa, Nigeria. And it was that convalescent serum that came from Penny, the second nurse, in Jos, that identified and also cured the next several people with Lassa fever. Because now, with all of this PCR business that they can do, they can take the IgG from a convalescent and just clone that thing like crazy and make an immunospecific globulin therapy. Now they don't have to give you all the stuff that's in Penny's blood. They just take out the IgG component and rapidly replicate billions of copies and give that to you. And that can neutralize the antigen. Now here's the real hang-up, and this is the hang-up that you don't want to know, as everything is quite nuanced. Once you complex the antigen and the antibody, takes the virus out of circulation, that should be all good. Not. Because once you get an antigen-antibody complex, you trigger white cell release of their interior proteins that start chopping up that sequestered virus. And they are lytic enzymes. They've got lots of names, and there are different ones of them, and they're all subdifferentiated. But altogether, they're called cytokines. So what the lethal problem in the COVID-19 is called cytokine storm. Ironically, if you didn't have an immune response, the virus would circulate all right around, But you wouldn't have enough antibody to trigger the cytokine release, and you wouldn't get the fulminant pneumonia. The pneumonia is not the typical invader that I breathe in a pneumococcus and it sets up shop in the alveolus, and white cells come in there and start coughing up virtually pus, which is the sputum that's infected with this stuff. It isn't an airway disease. It's an interstitial disease, just like the pneumocystis that I dealt with, just like the transplant rejection is. So that the lung, the air sac, seems to be okay. It doesn't get stiff the way the post-traumatic lung gets. It's still capable of being, now we use the term capacitance, which means that for any volume of air you push in there, that volume will come back, and it doesn't change as inflammation goes on because it's interstitial. So now I put in volumes of air in a normal lung that's got pneumonia, and it's filling up with fluid and white cells. I mean, you have to put higher pressure to get the same volume of change, and you have to do that. That's called the capacitance decrease there. It's called a plastic or leathery lung, very, very high resistance to airflow. You can ventilate the lung of a patient with COVID-19. It doesn't do them any good because the problem is interstitial. The oxygen that comes into the airspace can't get into the blood. Mm-hmm. Now what they're finding out a lot about, and this is really new stuff and it's all unknown, is that it's not just an inflammation on the interior of the lung, it's also of the vessels that go through the lung. And those vessels, when they get inflamed, set up thrombi, clots, triggers the clotting cascades. So a lot of things are happening rather soon. So one of the things that's actually occurring to some of these patients as a therapeutic trial is to anticoagulate them so they don't develop these clots. So one of the questions that's coming is, why are numbers of these patients who survive a trip on the ventilator coming back with renal failure? A lot of it is because they've embolized their kidneys, and there are microthrombi throughout their kidneys, which is another independent phenomena of the cytokine storm.
I didn't know that.
Now here comes another tidbit of evidence. Kids do well. Nobody even knows I've got the disease. They run around, yeah, except when they don't. And when they don't, it's bad, bad news. And this is something very similar to a disease that comes from an unknown antigen called Kawasaki disease. And that is, suddenly and abruptly, the body reacts with a whole bunch of antibodies to this stuff, and that triggers a cytokine storm, and they get the same kind of ventilation difficulty that the COVID-19 patients get. So when we're dealing with the thing that I was involved in the Vietnam era, and an interesting interview on those of us who come of age in the Vietnam era was just done by my blind running friend, Joe Oakward. I sent a note to you about his interview with me, and we'll maybe have that brought here. I was at NIH, and I had all of this ability to do anything I wanted to do, including primate lungs and using the membrane oxygenator and ECMO. And what I did is I studied what is the role of the lung in somebody who is injured. Because in the Civil War, if you got shot by a mini ball and hit your arm, they would amputate the arm, but you were going to die about 8 days later from sepsis. Mm-hmm. In the Korean War, they would pick you up and they would carry you with litter and they'd bring you to a place and not resuscitate you too vigorously. But if you survive that, you're going to come back with kidney failure. So it was dialysis that came along at that time. Remember, a halfway technology that isn't treatment for anything. It's buying time. And unless you had something that you could replace the kidney, transplantation, or rejuvenate it, unlikely. So what happened is that in Vietnam era, as I said, the first time in history where we had direct conflict casualties being the result of the greatest number of deaths, we had a brand new thing, they called it Da Nang lung, or shock lung, or post-traumatic pulmonary insufficiency. And why was that? You have somebody who's a young kid, let's say this kid is so good that he doesn't smoke, despite the fact that the C ration packs had cigarettes in them. And he's out there and he's fighting along and he gets hit by an AK-47 from the Viet Cong hostilities. and he breaks a couple of bones, and he's got blood loss in his pelvis, and he's got everything down here, everything below the waist. He pops into the intensive care unit, and they're flooding him with blood and plasma and antibiotics, everything else like that. And they stabilize this, they suppress the wound infection. He goes into sepsis. They scrape that out every day, they debride it, put him in a Hubbard tank to wash it all away. Goes back to the ICU, and he's on a ventilator, and he dies a death that's primarily pulmonary. A kid who never had a lung problem in his life, never got injured anywhere below, it's all below the diaphragm, nothing above. Why did he die a pulmonary death? Because of that cytokine storm with all these white cells clustering around the sepsis sites, and with the pulmonary emboli from the bone marrow and from fat emboli, everything else like that. He developed pulmonary insufficiency, and his death was primarily pulmonary. If it weren't for his lungs, they could have kept him going for another 6 to 8 months, having all these other things resolved. COVID-19 is the pulmonary insufficiency of the virus. And the cytokine storm that happens from sepsis, we talk about multiple organ failure. Everybody with COVID-19 happening and the cytokine storm, everyone says this patient can't get enough oxygen. Oddly enough, they're not gasping. They're talking to you. They're not, they're just sitting there, and then suddenly they fall off the cliff. When you're talking to them, their desaturation on the oximeter is very low. And then it becomes lower, and suddenly they're out. They're not, their lungs aren't filled with fluid, their lungs aren't coughing up anything, their chest x-ray doesn't look all that bad. And so we rush because we need the ventilator, we need to, and I told you how many people come off the ventilator. Now we have ECMO, people that can't come off the ventilator going into ECMO. We have all these other people, and they're saying, come on, they're dying. So mortality means we don't have a clue about their morbidity. We don't know what diseases they would have had later. Now we're getting survivors who weren't on the machine or got on the machine and come off. And now we find they got renal failure. We're dialyzing these people. And now we find out, in addition to that, they have arthritis, they have a number of other things, and they have all kinds of evidence of microbes thrombi or emboli because of the thing. So morbidity comes after a long period of convalescence. And the people that have had COVID-19 aren't bouncing back. They're crawling back. And you see a couple of these, and you see great big ceremonies and people are being discharged. In fact, there was a contest at GW on the web, on our interconnection line, everything being virtual. What song do you want played anytime a patient comes off a ventilator? And the leader at the moment is, "Here Comes the Sun." And so a new day is dawning. There are a number of these things. And these patients are supposed to come on out and high fives and cheers. Not. First of all, they have to wear a mask. So you don't know their real emotions, but they're kind of weak and they're not really bouncing back. And why? Because their lungs are able to oxygenate them now, but what's the rest of them? They look like they've been run over by a truck in terms of their being sore. Now you've had the flu, and you know what it's like to have the flu. And that is, you have some stuff here and you have some stuff here, but for the next 4 or 5 days, you feel like someone took a sledgehammer to you because of muscles and bones and everything else like that. We're now learning that the morbidity of COVID-19 has been unknown because the mortality was standing there. That was the 900-pound gorilla standing in the middle of it. And now those that are surviving are saying, let's get everybody to contact this virus so that we get more and more people who are immune. Not so fast, because number one, you don't know the morbidity until now it's coming out. Number two, you don't know if those antibodies are a marker or they're protective. And now we get the second wave showing you, not what everyone else means is a second wave, the virus re-entering an area of people who are not exposed to. We're talking about the virus entering an area of people who are exposed and have antibodies who are coming down with COVID-19 a second time. So that's why right now the realization is coming clear to everybody else, ahead to me for a while now, I think you heard me say it a while back. This isn't a one and done phenomenon, and now we're over it effective June 8 instead of today, May 15. It's part of the community and it's here to stay. There won't be the last case of COVID-19. Don't look to smallpox. Don't look to polio. And don't say, we knocked those out. Well, two reasons that we were able to knock out smallpox. It has no animal reservoir.
Mm-hmm.
And with the exception of some...
So if it's here to
Turkey
stay
dogs.
for a while,
Pardon me?
it's here to stay for a while.
Oh yeah, it'll be here. Or did we knock out the common cold?
Right.
And the answer to that is, well, that might be different. Well, it's a same RNA viral structure. It's got the identical structure. It's got a little antigenicity difference because the protein's on top of it. But we weren't real good at knocking the common cold into history.
Mm-hmm.
And we have been in only 2 disease entities in all of history have we eradicated them. And the one everybody knows about, and that is a plaque in the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, which went up when I was there. Donald Henderson from Johns Hopkins, formerly called the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, now called the Bloomberg Institute of Public Health. You can figure out why. And Donald Henderson was taken from Hopkins while I was in Boston as a resident, when I was at Brigham. And there I went to the World Health Organization, WHO. You know that
Oh, yeah.
dreaded organization.
Yeah, right.
And the WHO, Donald Henderson, took on the presidency and took on the challenge that he was moving from Baltimore to Geneva to coordinate a campaign to eradicate smallpox from the world. How do you do it? By testing and doing what I just told you about happened for the other 2 diseases that are common all through my African experience, at least in public health. Posters. Have you seen a child like this? Flaccid lower motor paralysis. We'll give you 100 pounds if you identify such a patient. So of course, patients are brought because that's 4 times an annual salary. And as a consequence, a lot of non-polio is found. But when they find one, in comes the swarm. And the surveillance monitors saturate that area. And they put on a polio vaccine campaign around that area as far as anyone has traveled. That's what happened with smallpox. And they saturated the world. And since that time, 1977, what they had done was that it's 10 years since the last smallpox case. So we are now going to officially declare at 10 years that it has been eradicated, it is no more. And so they hung the plaque there and they unveiled it, and Henderson was there. He's now retired from Baltimore and Johns Hopkins. Subsequently, they had one more case. The one more case was a laboratory accident.
Mm-hmm.
And you may ask, why do you still have that stuff around? Why is Fort Detrick carrying some of this stuff that no longer is? Well, you don't want it to get loose and cause another accident, do you? Well, what happens if something similar emerges and we don't have any experience at all? At least we've got it in the bank. You can pull it out and look at it. Okay, number 2 disease that is now officially been eradicated. This is a disease far more important to the people where I am in Africa, because remember I work with cattle cultures throughout the Rift Valley.
Right.
Rinderpest is a morbillivirus. A morbillivirus looks like a mulberry. I mean, it's a, a lot of you may think, look at lecture on lecture. Like measles. And like measles, it is the most communicable disease on the planet. I mean, there is no better communicable disease than measles. One kid in school goes to school, that school is saturated, 100% of the kids have measles.
Really?
The R value for coronavirus is 1.1.
What does that mean?
That means that if I am in a group of 100 people, one of those is likely to get the disease from me if I have prolonged enough contact, which is, as I said, in a close ventilation space. I just told you, a school. So it's 77 for, so one kid going into 77 people are going to get that.
So that's accurate. COVID is 1.1.
Yeah.
And measles is 77.
At least, I mean, let's just say for practical purposes, I use generically 100 times more communicable
I
than COVID.
understand. Yeah.
Okay, so measles is the most freely communicable, and it turns out that its comparable morbillivirus is rinderpest.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the same thing that brought smallpox, bubonic plague, out of the steppes of Asia was the Mongols and their uraks. The uraks is the most primitive of the oxen. It was, remember, oxen are Asian animals, and they were brought down and domesticated and they brought over. So the uraks was immune to rinderpest, and it carried it. And so one uraks coming along into Eastern Europe brings it through the Fertile Crescent down into the nomadic peoples coming down from the Fertile Crescent into the... Now, I deal in cattle cultures. They'd rather have 3 of their children die than 1 of their prize bulls.
Mm-hmm.
Remember that I used to say if my choices were available, I would shoot every one of those cows. And the reason is they're no economic value. They spread a veneer of feces on every potable groundwater. They are the source of infertility with respect to placental pathogens that may occur. There's some question about that. But the third thing is they are the source of a lot of hostility and a whole lot of cattle rustling and a whole lot of loss of life all through Sudan. I would shoot them all. They don't eat them, they don't milk them, they just stand and admire them. That's their bank account. No. They worship them. Let's just say it out loud. That's their cattle worship. And they did that in ancient Egypt, where they officially worship them. Today, they worship them sort of the way I do certain other tangible assets that's in your garage or whatever it is.
The question I have.
That means that rinderpest comes in and infects all the hoofstock of Africa. Then we'll get to that and go ahead and ask your question.
So knowing what you know and seeing the situation, the lay of the land right now, and the coronavirus is not going away anytime soon,
No.
despite all the efforts of lockdown.
It's not going away. Skip the anytime soon.
What do people do going forward?
What we do is do what we were doing before. You and I can relate and do our thing. First of all, neither of us are ill or know it. We are much less likely to be carriers than would be a child who's still experiencing the whole barrage of antigens in the world and hasn't experienced illness from any of them. So, yeah, what we do is go forward. Once someone is ill, the posse circles around and does whatever it can to identify the contacts, and again, sequestering them until they are no longer communicable. Now, until the vaccine comes along, at which point you can see if that's protective. We don't know that, and that's just one of those great big unknowns.
So that's really the challenge is, people go back to work, they function as normal daily activities. But if somebody gets sick, then you isolate that person and find out who they've been in contact with.
1, 2, 3.
Right.
Test, identify, contact surveillance.
Right.
And then social distancing. So what happens is that, now on the rinderpest, to you and me, a rinderpest is not communicable to us. Highly communicable, but we're not susceptible. So it comes down into the Great Rift Valley and it affects cattle. That's the source of all their pride, it's their deity. Not just their wealth, it's their esteem and everything else about it. And it spreads over to the wild hoofstock, with a couple of exceptions, but only one of those is of consequence that I want to go into because I happen to like this animal. And that is the spiral horns. You've seen the generic name for that is Trigolophus. And the very nice large one that you'll see in my room, Trigolophus scriptus and Trigolophus streptocercus. Trigolophus streptocercus is the greater kudu, which does not die. It has no susceptibility to rinderpest. However, it gets, strangely enough, the same thing that we get from herpes virus. It gets a keratitis. herpetic keratitis that we would have is a rinderpest keratitis in the case of, so older kudu goes blind. That doesn't affect their reproduction because it's beyond their regenerative period. So in consequence, that animal sort of a resistance piece of it, but all of it. So in essence, there was no treatment for rinderpest. There still isn't. There was, however, as in the case of measles, a very good vaccine. So what they did is they did the same thing that they're now doing for 2 other diseases. I told you about polio, but I also show you the guinea worm rolled up on a stick. Have you seen this? If you have 100 pounds, so everybody can even counterfeit them, trying to get their 100 pounds. But the Carter Foundation has largely taken that one on because that's within the size of the Carter Foundation, not the size that you need the Gates Foundation for. It's something that you could solve with $25 million and so on. So what they do is isolate them and then bring them to a spot that is just locked down, exactly like our multi-drug resistant TB. No one comes in, no one comes out until that thing is wound up and it's gone, and no one has contact with waterways, so they shed their eggs in the rear cilia. So what happens now is rinderpest vaccine in 1978, 1 year after smallpox, was declared 10 years extinct. It was in South Sudan, and that plaque is hanging in the confluence of the rivers in Khartoum. The Blue Nile and White Nile come together at Khartoum to make the Nile. So those are the 2 diseases in all of human history that have been eradicated. Most other diseases, you try not to eradicate them, but accommodate them. When syphilis came across from the New World, it went through Europe and everyone was dying. Aortic inflammation called lymphatic aortitis. Over time, it became secondary Louis. You get rashes and other things like that. And then it became tertiary Louis called general paresis of the insane, GPI, neurosyphilis. The Tuskegee, you remember?
No.
The Tuskegee Institute said treatment is toxic, therefore let's observe these patients over a period of 40 years and see how the disease matures without treating it. And this was in Tuskegee Institute, and these were African Americans. So a source of reparations and other things. Now what happens then is that those 2 diseases are eradicated, smallpox and rinderpest. 2 diseases, and we mentioned the one and how close we've come. Polio, 29 cases in 2019, and because of political prejudices, they're not And the last one there is that guinea worm, which I happen to like a lot because I saw a lot of it at one time in my life. And besides that, it has wonderful, fascinating stories to me. When I was a child, in Catherine DeVos's Child's Story Bible, I saw Moses in the wilderness elevating a serpent on a staff. And it's helped with me ever since. The Israelites were wandering in their captivity and escape from the wilderness there, right through the areas where Cyclops, the little crustacean in the water holes, is a carrier for guinea worm. And Moses said, as I lift up the serpent in the wilderness, and all who look upon him will be saved with this fiery serpents, the plague of fiery serpents, which is the therapeutic suggestion. You don't haul it out there because it breaks and it becomes inflamed. You let it emerge, rolled up on a stick, which I think is the source of the staff of Aesculapius, the single serpent on a staff.
Interesting.
And I've written that story, and that is already published. But that's the 4th disease. 2 of them gone, 2 of them going, and for all others, you would hope that we would mature in our relationship to it. Not again, there's a disease, eradicate it. Well, if we eradicate all diseases, we won't be very good with our immune system. Our immune system evolved for a reason, and that is to accommodate these diseases, not to completely wipe them off the planet. As you know already, that if you're a farm kid and are out there in the manure and chasing butterflies and doing all those things, your rate of asthma is very, very much substantially lower than if you're an apartment dwelling city dweller who has little exposure to that variety of antigens. So once again, a little humility about the arrogance and ignorance of my stomping out disease. So maybe I started there when I told you Hans Zinzer and Paul de Kruijf in Holland, Michigan, and got me started on a book called Rats, Lice, and History. And I saw most of human development that wasn't devolution in warfare was in humanitarian benefit that came from identifying the association of rats, lice, bacteria in history. And now I realize, well, it's the accommodation of them, not the eradication of all of them.
Right.
So let's kill every rat. That's the program going on in DC right now. And, well, you could do that. Lots of luck, because the rats outnumber us and they're a lot smarter than we are, and they can live under much harsher conditions. Those of us who are getting ourselves more and more hermetically sealed into highly specialized, what I call an ecologic niche that is a monoculture. I can only live in air-conditioned, filtered things with fluoridated water and refined foods, meaning that I'm pretty susceptible to the collapse of any one of those.
Right.
See which rat is going to go extinct from the disappearance of one of its food sources. See which shark or which cockroach is going to disappear from the world from the disruption of one of its possibilities. No, I think that humans have to learn from the resilience of the other biota around us and say, how do we accommodate the environment in which we're found, not steamroller it into submission. Because when we do that, we eradicate not just the disease, but the potential benefits. We are a whole tube of flora that we have accommodated. They make vitamin K for us. They crowd out pathogens. Way back in ancient history, there were little bacilli that invaded us, got into the cell, and disappeared, except for their little their little DNA packets, the cytochrome system. They're called mitochondria. That's why you can trace back before the development of Adam and Eve, right? Eve and the genes that are separated there. So yes, accommodating and being commensal, symbiosis is a whole lot better than combating. So I am no longer a combatant on the front line. I am someone who tries to seek to understand the relationship of health and disease and optimize one, which doesn't involve eradicating the other.
So you actually should have gone to Camp Black Bear.
I should have.
To be with nature and to expose yourself to nature.
And you know, I'm so soured about that I've come back and decreed that no one from henceforth should ever play golf.
Say, Jim, instead of doing your accounting, I have to go and play golf.
Yes, I think so.
Don't you think so?
You need to develop your
my
immune
doctor
system.
is saying yes.
Enhance your immune system.
How many more opportunities will you have to do the accounting? And how many more opportunities to play golf? It did not rain today. The sun was shining.
Shoot. Is
And
it
you
too
can
late to play?
You can do
It's
accounting
cooling
in the
off
dark.
right now. Yeah. Well, I think our calling for dinner.
I just heard that the numbers were going up there, sort of like the countdown.
Oh,
until
okay.
the-
Yeah.
and I just saw, I think
Lined it up because the grill has been working hard.
we're down to 2 fingers.
Okay.
Thank you so much.